Principled Way. And our speaker for this session is Matt Schulman. So Matt is the founder and CEO of Pave. And Pave helps founders like all of you make smarter compensation decisions for your team by allowing you to plan, communicate, and benchmark your compensation in real time. So Matt is a fellow IC alum, was previously a software engineer at Facebook, and he holds a degree in computer science from Penn and business from Wharton. Matt has had a lifelong passion for helping people fully understand and take control of their personal finances. And I'm seeing some messages in the chat that things were maybe a little bit abrupt in terms of the switch over to this session. So just for anybody who is kind of just getting in here, we're about to go on to our next session with Matt Schulman, the CEO of Pave. And we're going to be talking about compensating your team in a principled way. So while we're waiting for Matt, I see some of you guys here in the chat. Does anyone have thoughts on the last session? Or does anyone kind of want to talk about the questions that they might have for Matt around compensation for their team, just to kind of get him prepped with some of the questions that y'all might have for him? Don't be shy. Hard to match the expectations of the market in comp, especially in a startup. Yes. So that is definitely something that we will be chatting about today, which is some of the levers that you can pull as a startup when you can't compete with FANG comp and stuff like that. We have some employees impacted by inflation. We're also trying to conserve runway. We're going to talk about strategies for navigating that. That's a great question. Is there an agenda for all sessions and approximate times for each? Yes, there is. And I will send that right now.
Hey, how's it going?
Here. Hey, Matt.
I had some technical issues on my end, my fault.
No worries at all. Well, I have briefed our audience here about you, so I'm just going to hand it right over to you.
Awesome. And I can't really see who's in the crowd today, but maybe we could use the chat. If folks could just write maybe the name of their company and how many employees they have, that would help me sort of like target some of the talk track here. I'll go first. I'm Matt. We have like 140 employees, SF based. Maybe that's just for speakers. All right, I posted in the wrong one. There we go. Messages. Awesome. Welcome. I can't exactly figure out exactly how the chat. Oh wait, there's the Q&A. I don't know. I'm just gonna talk. I'm not sure who's in the crowd, but I'm assuming it's like private startups. So I think this is gonna be a fun one. I've given this talk a couple of times in the YC ecosystem. Usually it's like seed and Series A startups when I give it. So without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen. Cool. Awesome. I'm going to try to keep up the chat on the side and do my best to see if there's any questions as we go. I'm actually struggling to see the chat though. I think it's in the messages. So I guess I'll just talk for a little bit, and yeah, I'll do my best to sort of like tell some relevant stories about some of the best compensation practices that I've seen for earlier stage startups. I'll go into slideshow mode here. Just a little bit of an introduction. My name is Matt. I'm the founder and CEO of Pave. We were founded around March of 2020 is when we really got started, right at the beginning of the pandemic. It's kind of a crazy time in the world because that's when COVID started and sort of like took the world by storm. And you know, we entered this bear market, then this crazy bull market, then remote work. And there's just been so much confusion in the macro economy layer that has transcended down to the labor market as well. And there's just been so much confusion in terms of how compensation works in this crazy world that we're in. And obviously, we're entering a market downturn. And, a big question is, well, what happens to the labor market? So I've been having the time of my life. I used to be an engineer before I was working at Pave. And yeah, like I mentioned, we're about 140 employees today based in San Francisco. So today's goals, we're first going to talk about why it's so important to build a compensation philosophy. I think the word philosophy is a scary word. It's one that scares people a lot, especially earlier stage founders that just want to, get the engineers closed, get the offer letter signed, get the DocuSign inked. But I'm going to talk about why it's so important to take a step back and just build some basic fundamental building blocks of a compensation philosophy. It doesn't have to be super robust, but just doing a little bit of upfront work will save you so many headaches down the line. So that's going to be the first thing we talk about. The second thing we're going to be talking about is nailing the equity narrative. I think in the world of venture-backed startups, equity compensation in particular is the most confusing aspect of how compensation works. Stock option grants are very different company to company. No two stock option grants are alike. There's all the nuance of preferred price, common price, 409A, fair market value, etc. So we're going to go into the weeds on equity narrative, and you have to harness that because that is your secret sauce to nailing your early employees, especially engineers. So that'll be the second point. The third one we're going to talk about is just some of the tricks, the tips, the secrets. Sometimes I call it the founder elbow grease to scale your hiring practices, land all those early key hires that you need, and then scale that so that other hiring managers can also hire folks, in perpetuity. And then last but not least, we're going to talk about how to get the best market data to inform all these compensation decisions. Once you have your philosophy, maybe your philosophy is, hey, let's pay the 75th percentile. I'm going to talk about getting the right market data to inform total comp. So those are today's goals. So without further ado, let's jump into the first bucket, which is all around compensation philosophy. And again, this is kind of a scary term when people hear philosophy. A lot of founders I find in particular, maybe they were, engineers in a previous life. That's like a pretty common persona. They've never really thought about how to administer compensation. But one thing I would say is that compensation is not just salary. A lot of people, when they think about comp, they just think about what am I getting paid, in that biweekly cadence in Gusto or whatever. But the truth is, total compensation is much more holistic. It includes salary. It also includes equity. And I mentioned we're going to talk deeply about equity today. And it also includes benefits. Benefits are a key way to close a lot of employees if you're a founder in an early stage startup. Having good health insurance, I find to be a nice check of the box that doesn't cost the employer too much money, but really shows a lot that you care and can have a sort of disproportionate perception of value versus the cost. So today, again, we're mainly going to focus first on salary and then on equity, but don't neglect benefits. They're very important as well. So when you think about compensation at big companies, and a lot of folks, I used to work at Facebook, so that was a big company. I know a lot of folks come from some of these larger companies. They have a lot more structure than you're probably going to have in the early stages as a startup founder. They might have a very structured leveling framework. One of my favorite resources to look at is Level-Side FYI. Most of you have probably heard of it. If not, check it out. It's awesome. It's an incredible sort of crowdsourced comp data set that shows how much different people are getting paid at different companies, but even more importantly, they do it in a very good visual layout where you can see, okay, this is the Facebook leveling framework. This is the Microsoft leveling framework. This is the Stripe leveling framework. And you can see sort of how they coincide. So that's generally like one fundamental building block of comp at big companies. Another aspect is, generally speaking, they're very cash rich. They can pay top dollar. I remember when I was at Facebook, I would get like a piece of paper every 6 months that say, hey, this is your raise or this is your performance rating, and thus you get this many shares and this much money. And I would ask my manager why. And he used to say, hey, well, we pay at the 90th percentile. I was like, 90th percentile, what does that mean? And basically it meant that every year Facebook does a market analysis and says, you know what, we want to pay above the market. So if the market moves this much, we want to move even more to ensure that we're always paying top dollar for the best talent in the world. That's generally a staple of these large kind of FANG-like comp plans. Now, keep in mind also that these large public tech companies are also giving RSU grants, which are also in theory kind of liquid. So it's essentially like a cash bonus. So anyway, that's what you're going to be competing against. You will never win on just cash compensation, and you should not win on cash compensation, and you should actively sell against that. I use the talk track all the time with employees I'm trying to hire. Hey, If you want to optimize for short run cash, you should probably not be talking to me. You should probably go talk to Facebook or Google or Netflix. And I find that talk track to be pretty effective because I proactively objection handle. Okay, so that's a second staple. A third is limited flexibility. I think generally speaking, they're very rigid. They have a lot of formulas that sort of define exactly what a person at a given level gets paid. I think there's a little bit more of room for founder elbow grease, as I was alluding to earlier, to sort of give a little bit of customization to a compensation package. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then, yeah, generally speaking, they have robust talent pipelines and recruiting machines. But for the early stage startup, every single employee is a recruiter, especially the founder. That is like the number one responsibility for a founder. So that's a little bit about comp at big companies. This was a screenshot from Levels.fyi that I was talking about. In particular, my recommendation is know the Google and Facebook frameworks, like the back of your hand. You'll probably encounter a lot of engineers that have either worked at these companies or themselves are familiar with these frameworks. So when somebody says, hey, I was a Google L4 or hey, I was a Facebook E6, you should know what that means. But this is just a visual on the right about how Microsoft has like a parallel framework that sort of overlaps in like a weird, more granular way. So that's a little bit about the structured leveling frameworks. And there's like a trade-off decision that you're going to encounter many times. And it's like one of the toughest ones, in my opinion, as a founder, but it's the balance between doing what is fair and just doing what it takes to get the candidate in the door. When I was when we were in the early stages of Pave, I would ask some of our investors, I was like, hey, like, should I give this crazy signing bonus? Should I, flex on equity and give this engineer like a much bigger grant that they're asking for? And look, I would obviously, like, you got to do what's fair once you start to hit scale. But those first 5 hires, if you're in kind of the pre-seed phase, define your company. The people you bring in the door will define the future success narrative of the company. So strongly recommend doing whatever it takes to get, I don't know, those first 4 or 5 employees in the door. And they're a bit of a special case. However, once you pass that initial threshold and you have the beginnings of a team formed, I would strongly urge you to think about fairness. Because if you don't, and you just like willy-nilly just give one package here and one package there, and this person gets double the equity, this person gets double the cash, it will come back to haunt you, because compensation is one of those unique things in a startup life cycle that is truly one of those one-way doors. When you give an equity grant, you never get it back, and people will talk. The experiment I talk about a lot is like the New York Times experiment. If every single one of your employees a year from now, if all of their comp packages were leaked to the New York Times and everybody in the world could read them, you would need to be able to go to every single employee with a straight face, look them in the eye, and basically explain why all the packages are the way that they are. So anyway, my general attitude is like, do what you got to do for the first 5 or so employees, but then really think about fairness and setting up basic like frameworks about, hey, we pay at the X percentile for cash and the Y percentile for equity. That's the basics of a compensation philosophy. So that's like one key thing to think about. The second is a reliance on equity and upside, not cash, to attract talent. And I was talking about this. I sell against the fact that the FANG companies or Stripe or whomever, they're going to give offers that you simply cannot compete against with cash. You should not compete against with cash. But what you can sell is the equity and the upside. What you can sell is this generational wealth narrative. You can say, hey, if you want generational wealth, if you want to have ownership in this world, you have to join an early stage startup. That is the only way that you can truly have like piecewise impact on like the wealth of your family, essentially. So I use that talk track a lot, especially in the like seed and Series A phase. And then there's intangibles, right? Companies or employees are not only going to just come to you for the potential to be a millionaire due to their ISO grants. They care about the mission, they care about the team, they care about the culture. Find whatever your unique cultural thesis is, your unique value props that are specific to your company, and sell the heck out of them. So intangibles matter to a tremendous degree, especially in the early stages of a startup. Ironically, given that we're talking about compensation. But yeah, that's just like some high level thoughts about comp. So yeah, basically, like, we keep talking about this topic of a compensation philosophy. And in short, in essence, what that means is you need to pick a percentile for both cash and for equity. At Pave, we pay the 75th percentile for both. That was sort of a decision we made early on. What I've realized is that it's very hard to change from that decision, because if you do, you have to redo everyone's comp at the company. you can also, it's very difficult to go down. Once it's much easier to go up. So think about it. Don't just like make a decision with a snap of the finger and think you can change it later. It will be very difficult to change it. But yeah, that's what we do. We said we don't want to pay 90th percentile, because if we did 90th percentile, well, we'd probably attract the wrong type of candidate who's a little bit too money hungry. We want to have somebody that's a little bit more mission oriented. But you know what? We do want to pay above market. Our strategy is to be well capitalized, have deep pockets, and then go after the best talent in the world so that people don't have to be stressed about their finances. So the balance of these two interests, we said, you know what, 75th seems to make sense for us. So that was how we went through kind of setting up this initial compensation philosophy or framework early on. But the reasons that you want to have this is that, one, this provides clarity for candidates, for hiring managers, for employees. It's just like a simple framework that provides clarity. And then, of course, it prevents against pay inequity over time. And what I can say is that cash, you can actually fix that somewhat decently over time and sort of like normalize everybody in a given job band to the same salary range. However, with equity grants, again, that is like a point in time event, right? And if you're given like, I don't know, your fourth engineer, let's say 1% of the company, well, you're going to be giving your 40th engineer, I don't know, like 3 basis points or something. Like the curve of percent ownership, like, is so steep as you raise your Series A and then your Series B and then your Series C, etc. And what that means is that if you have, stock option grants and equities at the offer letter in the early stages of a company, maybe one engineer got a percentage point because they negotiated harder, another engineer only got 50 basis points. Well, what seems maybe like a small sort of delta in equity value today, maybe it's a $100,000 grant versus $50,000 if your company's worth $10 million. Well, once that company's worth $1 billion, like the equity value delta is just going to get so big over time. So the point of this is that cash is a little bit easier to fix, but equity is something you probably will never fix ever. So again, after you do that, whatever founder elbow grease is needed for those first 5 employees, in my opinion, you got to have some rigid structure, or else you're going to have all these issues with pay inequality over time, and people will talk. You should assume that every single one of your employees will talk openly about this. I see it happen at pretty much every startup that I work with. So that's why it's so important. And again, it's this like fine balancing act of fairness and getting the job done. So here's an example from our data set of what happens if you don't think judiciously about setting up this philosophy that acts as the backbone of your company. This is from our data set showing basically a female percentage of male. And again, salary is there's a little bit of noise in our data. I think this was taken a year ago when our data set was a little bit smaller. So salary, again, you can fix that over time. But equity, look at the disparity between female and male. This is female percentage of male equity grants across our data set. This is what happens if you don't think about it today. Okay, so once you have your compensation philosophy, again, ours is to pay at the 75th percentile for cash and for equity. The next step is to basically say, okay, well, now we have to go and get the market data. We have to understand, well, what does an engineer make at a seed stage startup at the 75th percentile in Austin, Texas, or whatever your unique sort of parameters are. And here are a few different data sets. Obviously, Pave is one of them, so feel free to use Pave. It's free, but would also recommend using Option Impact. That is a resource used by a ton of startups. Levels.fyi, I mentioned them before. Where they're uniquely helpful is that they're a crowdsourced data set, which means that they can collect data from all these random companies, including some of the larger like FANG type companies, which Pave and Option Impact do not have. So, if you have an engineer that's looking at Google or your startup, and let's say you're a Series A startup, well, first of all, I would sell hard against Google. I say, why are you even talking to Google if you're trying to join a startup? But that's more of an emotional appeal. But if you want to understand like what this engineer is probably going to get in their job offer from Google, I would go to levels.fyi, figure out what level you think that person is, and then see what the median sort of salary and RSU grants are for that, whatever, L6 engineer at Google. So yeah, that's how I use levels.fyi. Glassdoor, I wouldn't recommend using as much, honestly. I put it here, but it's more self-reported data. Levels.fyi is also self-reported. I just find levels.fyi to be a much better sort of granularized data set than Glassdoor. Levels.fyi also has equity as a first-class citizen, whereas Glassdoor does not. And then Pave, the way we do it is we integrate with company systems. So we have, this is a little bit dated, we have about 2,600 companies now of seed to public tech companies in terms of how much the market is making. But yeah, whatever you use, strongly like recommend using market data, whether it's Pave or not. I don't care. Just like use market data, use it to back up and bolster whatever your compensation philosophy is. It is just probably the most important thing you can do as a founder. And if you don't do it, you will pay years of debt, of people debt over time. So that's like a little bit about market data. All right. So once you get the market data, you have to think about flexible strategies to remain competitive. And we've talked about the notion of fairness, right? We actually take fairness to a very far degree. At Pave, we do this thing called first and best offer, which basically means, hey, look, you're an engineer, you're a P4 engineer in San Francisco. Maybe your offer is, I don't know, $160,000 of salary and $200,000 of equity or whatever it is. We give that offer, we show the data that we use to make that offer, and we say, hey, if you don't like this offer, tough luck, I'm sorry, but we are a company that prides itself on pay fairness and pay equity. And thus, one of the ways we do this is we don't negotiate with candidates at the offer letter phase. So that is like a pretty rigid stance, and sometimes we lose candidates, but it's also a selling point because candidates know that they're going to get a fair offer. However, I will caveat this, and because I'm speaking with founders, there's one sort of trick that I find to be a good one that doesn't breach too strongly against the notion of fairness, and that is signing bonuses. Signing bonuses are a one point in time event. You give a $30,000 signing bonus. It's not going to, put that particular employee at a super high point in the band. But it's usually a nice little bit of an incentive for that person to sign the offer if they're deciding between your offer and another one. So signing bonuses is something I use. You could also think about relocation expenses, commuter benefits, etc. Some of these things are, point in time events that can be uniquely helpful in getting candidates to close. For instance, if I have a candidate that is in Hawaii, I will find what island they are on, find the nicest restaurant on that island, and then get them a gift card to that restaurant and say, hey, it's on Pave. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us. So you can do those kind of unique emotional appeals. I find them to be extremely effective. But yeah, TLDR, signing bonuses are extremely effective. I'll talk in a second about what we call the cash versus equity trade-off slider, because that's a very controversial approach that sometimes works, but you got to be careful. Second point here is, again, make a strong first offer. I find that if you are super far removed from a candidate, like with that initial offer, maybe they want 2 percentage points and you're trying to give 20 basis points, it almost never works out. I don't think I've ever had a case work out. And I've had many cases where I'm just like light years removed in cash or in equity from like where a candidate wants to be. If that's the case, it's probably not going to work out with that candidate. And part of what that means is my strong rec is don't mess around with these candidates. Treat them with respect. Make a strong first offer. In our case, like I mentioned, we make our first offer our best offer, right? But yeah, whatever you do, even if you don't do that, make it a strong offer. Otherwise, it's just going to be sort of weird, and it's going to be a red flag in the eyes of the candidate. And then, transparency, I think, is so crucial and a huge advantage. Again, we take transparency like to the furthest degree. I literally will send them a CSV with the market data that we used to price that offer. So I show them exactly what I'm looking at and I say, look, let's price your offer together. Sometimes they'll get on a screen share and say, hey, let's look at Pave, then let's look at option impact. We're going to look at the 75th percentile for each. Here's a little bit of noise in the data, and here's how I'm thinking about reconciling that noise, and thus this is your offer. So you see exactly what I see. And that notion of like collaboratively defining the offer, especially in the early days when it was like our first 10 engineers that we were hiring, I found that to be exceptionally effective. So yeah, those are some general thoughts there. Sometimes I have founders that ask me about what is called the cash versus equity trade-off slider. And the basic premise there is that you'll probably encounter a lot, especially engineers I found, but you'll probably encounter a lot of candidates, especially in the early stages of a startup, that want more equity and are willing to sacrifice cash. And the way they'll say it to you is like, hey, Matt, I believe in the company. I want to get in early. I want ownership. Everything you're saying resonates with me. Can I sacrifice, $30,000 of salary to get, I don't know, $30,000 more of equity or something like that? And we did this in the early days. And to be clear, like it is part of that sort of like founder elbow grease closing motion for those first 5 employees that we used. I would generally like put it on a 1-to-1 scale and sort of like make a spreadsheet where it's like as cash that goes down, equity goes up by some multiple that you dictate. However, we stopped that when we had about 25 employees because we found it to be a way where compensation inequities can evolve over time, right? if a candidate that comes from a wealthier background is more willing to take risk, right, and sacrifice cash in exchange for equity, it's unfair that they sort of have that unique advantage and are able to do that. Given that, what I was talking about earlier, small gaps in equity grants today become massive over time as the company's valuation multiplies. So we don't tell companies not to do this. My general take is, if you're going to do it, just be very careful and be explicit with people and understand the potential pay equity issues over time that could emerge. But it can be an effective practice to closing candidates, especially in the early days of a startup. That's my general thought on the cash versus equity slider. All right, moving along. So outcomes of establishing comp bands. It is not just about pay fairness or pay equity. I know I keep talking about that. It is also about efficiency. And what I mean by this is, I think it's funny because a lot of the times we talk about in sales, there's like the founder-led sales motion, and then a major de-risking point in the company is when you go to an AE-led sales motion. Well, it's very similar with candidates. There's the founder-led candidate close, and you'll probably be doing it for the first 30, 40 employees. Maybe you'll interview up to 100, whatever it is. However, eventually you are going to need your hiring managers to be able to close candidates, and you need to have the right constraints to ensure that it's done effectively and also consistently. So with that being said, you need to have compensation philosophies in place. You need to define what these talk tracks are around the compensation philosophies. And then you don't want to have to revisit this for every single candidate. So documenting this is huge in terms of efficiency as you scale your company. And it's not just with closing candidates, it's also about with merit cycles. Usually I find that companies will start doing merit or promotional cycles once they hire their first senior HR person, generally somewhere between 75 to 100 employees. I've seen it happen earlier. I've seen it happen later. But yeah, that's the key behind comp bands. Okay, we've talked a lot about philosophy. Now let's talk about nailing the equity compensation narrative, which is non-trivial. It's not as simple as here's your grant, here's how much it's worth. So most startups are giving stock option grants rather than RSU grants. There are two flavors of stock option grants, ISOs and NSOs. Usually, you're probably going to be giving ISO grants, although in some unique cases, it might be an NSO grant. If you are giving stock option grants internationally, it is likely a completely different structure with different taxation consequences. A key mistake that I made is that I didn't get the localized counsel or accounting support in England when we hired UK employees early on, and I screwed it up. And as a result, our employees had to pay a lot more taxes than otherwise they would have if I had done my job better. So a word for the wise, if you are hiring internationally and giving equity packages to international workers, make sure that you know the localized tax schema and are doing everything you can to get preferential tax treatment for your employees there. Learn from my mistakes, please. But yeah, usually you're going to be giving stock options in the early days. One question I often get from candidates is like, why are you giving stock options? Why can't I just get RSUs? Why the heck do I have to exercise this thing? You mean to tell me that I'm going to pour my blood, sweat, and tears into your company, and then I'm going to have to pay, right? Exercise price. I'm going to have to pay to own that equity. But what the talk track that you can use is, look, stock options are all about exactly that. Options, optionality. Stock options are an artifact of like a tax code system that actually gives preferential treatment to early startup employees. It gives them optionality to determine when and how they get taxed. And that is a huge, huge perk of joining an early stage startup, especially when the cost basis or the exercise price is quite low, requisite with the future potential value of that equity grant. So that's like one talk track about why stock options exist. I use that all the time if I'm talking with an engineer from Google as an example. But yeah, the basic mechanics are that there's an exercise price. You have to pay that much money to basically own that equity. You can determine when you want to exercise it. Some companies offer what's called early exercising. It's about 15 to 20% of the market in our data offers early exercising. I would recommend it. There's no economic cost to the company other than the administration of the paperwork and everything. But yeah, basically you can allow your employees ideally to early exercise. You don't have to, but my recommendation is to do so. They can then own that equity either when they are granted it as it vests or when they leave the company. There's something called a post-termination exercise window. Market standard today is 90 days, although we're seeing it creep to like 7 years or 10 years. And this exercise price, also known as strike price, is dictated by this process called the 409A appraisal process. where basically this accounting firm comes in. A lot of companies use Carta. You can also use Pulley. There's other services as well. And they'll basically say, hey, the common stock price is $1 a share. And usually what's confusing as heck is that your investors, they just paid a different price for a preferred share. And this happens at your first priced round. And maybe the investors, they paid $4 a share. Well, there's two different prices. There's the price for the preferred share and the price for the common share. And usually market standard is to basically price the grants based off the investor price, not the 498 price. But there's a lot of ambiguity there because a lot of your candidates are going to want to say, oh, well, what's the difference between common and preferred? And it's up to you to basically sort of say, look, over time, the common and the preferred prices will, sort of merge to the same value when there's a liquidation event or when we go public. So market standard practice is to do the gross equity value based off the preferred price, the most recent investor price. That is market standard today. Cool. Let's go to some specifics. Vesting schedule is relatively simple. It's the time over which your stock is earned. Market standard is 4 years. I've seen some companies use 5. I've seen occasionally I'll see a company do 6. My rec is just keep it simple. Do market standard 4 years. Cliff standard is 1 year. Basically, if you leave before that cliff date, that 1 year mark, you get none of your equity. And then there's refresher grants. My general thesis or recommendation for refresher grants is that companies generally don't offer them until they have employees that have at least 2 years of tenure in the company. So if you don't have employees that have 2 years of tenure, you're probably a little bit ahead of your skis if you're already doing refresher grants. Okay, exercise window. Let's talk about the standard post-termination exercise window. This question comes up a lot when I'm talking with candidates, and it has a lot of nuance. So it used to be the case that the traditional post-termination exercise window is 90 days, which basically means that if you're an employee and you haven't yet exercised your equity and you leave the company, either voluntarily or involuntarily, you have 90 days to make a decision about whether or not to exercise the equity. And keep in mind, if you exercise, that means you're shelling out cash and potentially it will never come back, right? If the company goes under, belly up, that employee will never see any money come back. So it's a risk. It's like, are you willing to sort of like stomach that risk? And 90 days is a pretty short time. If you join the company when it's a seed stage startup, you leave after 4 years and it's a series, D startup. Well, maybe it's still 5 years away from an IPO. And that's pretty scary. What some companies started doing is implementing a 10-year exercise window. I think Uber was like a big proponent of this. Airbnb was a big one. I think some companies have also done 7 years, such as Pinterest. And at the surface, this sounds like an incredibly employee-friendly perk. And I think it is the market trend, and we're considering it internally now. Should we switch from 90 days to 7 years or to 10 years? However, I will note that it is not so simple. There's a lot more nuance to it. A16Z has a really good blog post on this. And the main issue with a longer post-termination exercise window is that it is a direct transfer of wealth from current employees to ex-employees, right? If every ex-employee has 10 years to decide whether or not they want to exercise, well, in theory, if in 7 years the IPO happens, they're all going to exercise so that they get their liquidity. And that means that current employees are going to be diluted and you will have a more difficult time giving them more equity incentives to keep them around, keep them retained because of this direct transfer of wealth to ex-employees, which to me seems a little bit unfair. So there is some nuance and you're going to have to balance your fiduciary interests and in the long run incentive interests of the company with like employee friendly sort of packaging as it pertains to the post-termination exercise window. I have a blog post on this. There's a lot more nuance than just what I said there. But just know post-termination exercise window is probably something that will come up with the candidates. And whether you choose 90 days or 10 years or 7 years or something in between, make sure you have a good talk track about it. As it pertains to nailing the equity narrative, my recommendation is spend ample time explaining it to candidates. We have a tool that you can use. It's like a visual offer letter tool, or you can make a spreadsheet and sort of like list out the facts in a spreadsheet. And it's crazy. I have so many friends that get offers from startups and they like don't get told the basic terminology or what the exercise price is, what the most recent valuation is, or what their percent ownership is. And a lot of the times you can sort of piece together the facts and figure out this information. But it's just like, in my opinion, a big red flag if you're a candidate and you receive an offer from a startup that doesn't proactively tell you all these facts. So my strong recommendation is share these facts. It might be a little bit scary. It's like a Pandora's box opening moment. You're like, do I really want to tell the nuance of like the 409A price and the preferred price? That seems kind of sensitive to me. But it's standard practice to be transparent and proactive about this information is standard practice today. And you should be transparent and make that a competitive advantage rather than something that hamstrings you. So yeah, definitely I would recommend communicating the equity and ownership, both in percent ownership as well as dollars. Now that changes once you're a little bit later stage. Generally later stage companies, maybe Series B, Series C-ish, will start start communicating primarily in dollars rather than both dollars and percentage. But my recommendation for the early stage is to do both. Again, for the dollar amount, you basically look at the number of shares and you multiply it by the most recent investor price. That is what you call the gross equity value, and that is generally the market standard for what you communicate. Also communicate the vesting schedule. Also communicate the 409A / fair market value / exercise price. And then here's one of my biggest tips: if a fundraise is imminent, close candidates ASAP before you sign the term sheet. Because as soon as you sign the term sheet, you essentially render the previous 409A defunct, and you no longer are legally allowed to give stock option grants that are pinned to that 409A. And usually, if it's a fundraise, assuming it's an up round, the 409A value is going to go up, which means that there is a materially higher cost basis for an employee to exercise their grant after this point in time versus before this point in time. So the best time to close candidates is right before you sign a term sheet. That's like one of the best pieces of advice that I have for you. We already talked about valuing your equity, TLDR. If you have not yet raised a price round, so maybe you're raising on like a YC post money safe or something like that, you can basically look at what the post money valuation is, look at the percent ownership you're given to that person based off the fully diluted share count, and just multiply the two together. And of course, modeling out exit scenarios is crucial to like shaping this future sort of vision of like how much their equity could be worth and the potential ownership scenarios in the future. You could use a tool like the Pave visual offer letter. You could also do this in Excel. Okay, compensating your first hires. Again, make sure to go in, get market data. Generally speaking, there's different philosophies that I've seen startups have. If you're hiring remotely across the US, the more common sort of new age thing to do is actually to pay the same amount of money regardless of where a person is located. Historically, compensation philosophy has been to charge a discount based off where you're located in the US. As you can see here, if you look New York and SF, they're kind of in lockstep. This is for an entry-level software engineer in terms of salary. LA is a little bit of a drop, and you keep going. Different markets, like there is a discounting factor. However, we're seeing this gap, this wage gap between the deltas, especially in the early stage land, decrease given the dynamics of a labor shortage as well as overcapitalization in the private markets, despite the market downturn that is impending. So just a little bit of candor there. I find a lot of the time that especially technical founders or founders that have not ever done a go-to-market motion struggle to sort of like figure out the right sales comp strategy in the early days. My general rec is for the first AE, account executive, that you hire, assuming you're doing a B2B SaaS motion, is in the early days to do about a 70-30 split, 70% cash, 30% variable. Variable is like the sales person's commission. This is because, again, a huge de-risking point in the life cycle of a startup is the transition from a founder-led sale to an AE-led sale. And because of all that risk, you want to ensure that salesperson is not doing bad things, such as like closing shitty revenue and then just throwing it over the fence to the engineers or to the IM team, implementations team. So a 70-30 split is generally a little bit more aligned with not like over incentivizing them towards like just closing revenue. However, over time, once you start to see repeatability, you generally speaking want to get to a 50-50 split. That is market standard for a B2B SaaS company. David Sachs in particular has a great article about how to set up sort of sales compensation structures. So strongly recommend taking a look at that once you start to have repeatability with the sales motion. But in the early days, market standard is to do a 70-30 split. Other things for the first 10 hires, again, especially with the market downturn and the lack or the sort of like the frozen nature of capital in the private markets, definitely be very cognizant of how much money you've raised and how much you have left to give. You should probably talk with your investors or board about like what an appropriate runway is. You should also, I find a lot of founders in the early stage, they just like have no idea how big their stock option pool is, like their employee stock option pool is. So just be aware of that. if you bleed through all of your equity because you're just way too giving with equity, it means that everybody's going to get overly diluted, including you, including your investors, including your hires. So just like be mindful of how much equity you're giving up and how it pertains to the current size of your pool and how much you have left. And then, yeah, I mean, think about the other basic fundamentals of how senior the person is, if it's a highly in demand role, etc. All right, let's talk about COVID and remote. We've got about 3 minutes left here. This goes back to what I was saying before. Traditional compensation philosophy is more on the left side here, where you have geo tiers. This is traditionally how the FANGs have done it. And still to this day, most of them do it. Although we're seeing a couple of large companies making the swing over to the right side. Airbnb was the most notable one. They did this about a month ago, where they said, hey, we don't care where in the country or honestly where in the world you're located, we're going to pay you the same rate, which is kind of a new radical way of how remote work compensation is being institutionalized into the world. What I've seen is that this sort of free borders approach that we see on the right is much more common in the earlier stage sort of startup segment. So make a decision either way, but have a philosophy. We talked about having a philosophy in terms of like whatever, 75th percentile for cash and for equity. Also have one in terms of your remote work hiring strategy as it pertains to comp, assuming that you're hiring remotely. This is basically like a visual showing how that delta has very much decreased from pre-COVID to where we are today. The delta between tier 1 and tier 3 markets in our data set decreased from about 18% pre-COVID for like a senior software engineer to about 6%, Q3 2021. So about 6 to 9 months ago. That is crazy. That is the invisible hand acting in front of our eyes as it pertains to the wage gap compression. Okay, international employees. TLDR, use a tool like Deal. Deal's kind of the market leader. Remote is also amazing. Ensure that you have a good tool in hand to basically hire these people. In general, I'm going to rush through the last slides because we have 2 minutes. In general, it's easier to hire people as contractors, especially as a first step. I will note that if you're hiring European employees and you make them full-time employees and you ever want to have to terminate them, it is very difficult to do, much harder than in the United States or California where it's like at-will employment. And I talked about this earlier. Foreign equity can be very gnarly. Ensure that you are taking advantage of all the right preferential tax treatment. It is worth the time and money to spend talking with a localized tax and equity expert in those locations if you're hiring internationally. All right, rapid fire tricks and tips. Founder elbow grease is assumed. You are selling. And it's not just about the numbers. It's about dinners, coffees, walks, handwritten notes, Loom videos. I send Loom videos all the time to candidates. They're shocked to receive a Loom video, and it is so effective. Build rapport, hustle, do whatever it takes. Another trick I use is I create like a Google Doc where I outline everything about me, about the candidate, my conviction in them, the back channels I've done on them, like, the risk factors. I just tell them everything. And then I write like a whole career plan for them. And I find the collaborative Google Doc to be incredibly effective in terms of showing the person that you care and also giving them an ability to have asynchronous communication with you. So yeah, the async Google Doc is one of my best tricks. I would say Loom videos and the async Google Doc are like my 2 sort of like secret sauces that I would recommend. And then, yeah, I mean, I alluded to some of these. Feel free to use our products if you want. You don't have to. I don't want to like be too promotionally. So I will say the benchmarking product is free. So not much harm there. And then, yeah, the visual offer letter is a way to help sort of consistently shape that equity narrative and the total compensation narrative. And we were talking about that earlier. So these are 2 of our